Welcome to the Workbook Statistics and this unit about frequencies. When we talk about frequencies, usually what we think about is a so-called frequency table. Something like this, where here we have absolute frequencies, so how often a certain value or group is represented in the original data. Before, however, we continue with other columns, other aspects of the frequency tables, let me give you one preliminary comment on different types of frequency tables. As you can see here on the left, I've written down group 1, 2, and 3. Whenever we have groups or classes or intervals on the left, that's usually when you work with classified data. However, the real frequency table would have only certain values here on the left. So for example, if we have height, I would have one row only for 1 meter and 70, 1 meter 90, something like this. Whereas if I have groups, I could have an interval from 160 to 170 here. In the end, for what we are going to calculate in the next few columns, the difference doesn't actually make any, big changes occur, but it's always interesting to keep in mind that there are more or less two types of frequency tables. Well, I already said we have the absolute frequencies, which are usually given, or which we can easily get from the raw data. And then most often we are starting by adding one additional row below. And in this row, we're going to summarize all the values above. So with the absolute frequencies, we add up all these numbers, get the overall number of observations. So in this case, would be 60 observations. Because in the next step, we're going to need those 60 observations. Because in the next step, we're going to calculate the so-called relative frequencies. So that's how many of these 60 are in group 1. Here it's 15. But in some cases also might make sense to say that's this and this much percent of the whole sample which we considered, which are part of group 1 or part of group 2, 3 and so forth. And that's what the relative frequencies are for, expressing the frequencies in percentage terms. How do we calculate them? Well, it's relatively straightforward. We take the absolute frequency and divide it by the sum. So it's 15 by 60, giving us 25% for group 1. Then it's 26 divided by 60, giving us here roughly 0.4333 or 43.33%. And finally, 1960 or roughly 0.3167. The interesting thing, if you want to control whether you calculated them correctly, is by adding up those relative frequencies as well, because in the end they always need to end up being 1. Well, here it's the case, so we work decently well. Then, frequency tables quite often have this third column as well, the relative cumulated frequencies. That's all the frequencies, all the relative frequencies added up until this certain group. So here I would add up all relative frequencies up to this group. We can see this in more detail. Well, in the first one, I'm simply going to copy the relative frequency from the class 1, from group 1, because there's nothing before this. So before there was 0, now we have the 25 added from the first group. In the next part, we're going to take the 25 from here, going to add the 43.33 from here. That's this part. That's one way to think about it. To make our lives a bit easier, we're not always going to add up all of these numbers in this column. Because, here we only have 3 groups. But imagine if you have a table with like 50 groups, then this would lead to a lot of unnecessary calculations. But we can make our lives much easier because this value already sums up all the different groups above this. So we can take these 25 or 25% and add the 43 from here. So we could go take this one and add that one. Will yield the end result, which is actually the same as we would have added up all of the relative frequencies, but in this case we just have to add up two numbers, which is much easier. So in this case we get 68.33%. Then we're going to add to this here the relative frequency of the new group, the new class, which here is the 31.67%. If we calculated this correctly, we will end up at 1.0. Well, maybe a little bit larger or smaller if you have rounding errors, but in the end it should be 1. It should be the same one as down here, because in the end you will always get 100%. So if those weren't 100%, this would mean that there would be observations which are not part of any of the groups, or that there are actually more observations in the groups than there are in total, which cannot happen. So these two values always have to be 1. And that's a good way to control whether you did your work correctly. Well, that's then everything there is on the construction of frequency tables. Hope you enjoyed it. I say goodbye and see you next time.